Okay, so what is the difference between concave and convex? You might remember it from school, or maybe you don't, but as you see here in the graphics, a concave object is an object that at least has parts of it that goes inwards, and a convex object is only built in a way that everything goes outwards. That's what it means. Why is this important in the context of bullet simulations? Well, because you have to understand when you're a programmer, you have to find a way of calculating the collisions between objects. And remember, Bullet does not understand SDFs, so this is something we can't use here. And the thing is, when you can basically rely on the fact that whatever geometry you are checking against is convex, then the calculation will be much easier and faster. So basically, I don't want to go too deep into this, but basically imagine when you have two objects and you know that they're convex, then you can be sure that if one point of one object is behind the points of another object, then there will be a collision. If you think about this, if the object is concave, then that's not necessarily always true. In a concave object, you could be behind the point of the object and still be outside of the object. And then you would have to calculate way more because you basically have to check almost every single point for a collision. So way more work when working with concave objects and therefore a much slower calculation. And the difference we're talking about here is, tenfold. So it's really worth the effort of making sure that every object that goes into an RBD simulation will be convex. By the way I remember this is a concave, from the English word cave that goes inwards. That's easy to remember, a cave. And then convex, and I know this is a bit stupid, but there's vex in the name. So vex, we all like vex because it's a programming language of Houdini, and therefore convex is good. I know that's a bit stupid, but that's how I remember it. So keep in mind, Bullet always expects the incoming object to be convex, and if that's not the case, then it will automatically turn it into a convex object. And that's kind of the problem. What is better is if we take care of this and make sure that every object that goes in is convex. And in this video, we'll have a look at how to do this. Because of course you can still work with concave objects, but spoiler, you have to convert them into convex objects, and we will see how to do this next. And now let's have a look at ways of doing this. So first of all, because it's interesting, let's create this together. We want to create a couple of bowls because those are basically the hardest case of calculating collisions because they are super concave. So now we have our sphere here and we could use a clip, for example, to cut it in half, and you can switch the direction up here. And now we use a poly extrude to give that thing a little bit of thickness, something like that. And it seems like we're done, but be careful. The poly extrude by default does not create a backside. So make sure that you remember to do this. Otherwise, a lot of stuff will behave very weirdly after that. Now it's correct. And this is actually a shape that is kind of the hardest possible case for an RBD simulation because it's almost completely concave. Let's move this up a little bit with a transform, for example. There you go. Let's make the lighting a little bit nicer with an HDR. I always dislike this gray and gray. There you go. Bit nicer at least. And now that we moved it up, we want to let it fall down, of course. So let's create an RBD bullet solver. Let's rewind. And when I press start, it just falls down. So let's make sure we create a ground plane as well. And if you run this, you can see collision. What's the problem? What's the big deal? Well, let's make it a bit harder for the whole thing because the lower part, of course, is convex. So let's make it harder for ourselves by creating a couple of copies of that with a copy and transform, not afterwards, but before, and move it up. And we create a couple of copies of our bowl here. And this will really be a challenge for our simulation. So let's run this. And then this happens. So what the hell is going on here? As we've seen, and we already mentioned, the RBD bullet solver will always turn concave objects into convex objects. And we can actually visualize this under visualize. And here you have to be careful. There are two things to visualize. The simulation geometry, which is the active geometry that is simulated. And then there is the collision geometry, there it is, show collision, that we've seen in form of the blue box before. So if I turn this one here on, show geometry representation, in blue we see what our active objects are actually turned into. Now, unfortunately, to my knowledge, there is no way to turn off the visibility of the normal geometry, but you can still see the problem, right? It turns it into a convex object. And by the way, if you run this now, you can see it's much slower. So my tip would be only turn it on for a short amount of time to really check what's going on and then turn it off. It creates a lot of additional work for Houdini to show this. So this is why I usually only turn it on for a short amount of time. Now, first of all, we can technically switch this function off, but I would not recommend that, and I would like to quickly show that to you. So first of all, here in the front, you cannot actually change this. This is under solver bullet object. This is the area where you can change the settings for your active objects. And there is no way of turning it from convex to concave. But just for you to know, in case you see it, someone else doing it or something, the bullet solver actually doesn't show it to you, but it is possible. So if I set allow editing of contents and go into my setup here and look for the .NET, I can find here the active object, not the collision object, but the active object. And here in that object, there is a function called geometry representation. And I could technically switch this to concave. And when I go back and then visualize how this looks like, you can see it actually takes the geometry the way it is. And in some instances, it might even work like here. But first of all, it's about half the speed that you would usually get, which is not a big deal, to be fair, in this case. But as soon as we make the whole thing a bit more complex by, for example, increasing the amount of pieces, and imagine you destroy a building or bridge or something, you have way more than just 14 pieces. And as soon as you give it a little bit more complexity, this thing happens. It starts to become super unstable and even implodes basically. Let's quickly turn off the visualization, by the way, so here you can see better what's going on. This happens. This complete nonsense. So the result is not just inaccurate, it's completely wrong, because it basically is overwhelmed by the complexity. And also look at the frame rate that you get 6 frames per second or something like that, and a lot of problems. Now, this doesn't work. So even though it's technically possible, it does not work. So let's turn this red. And while you're not looking, I will quickly solve this problem and show you the comparison. So here's the correct setup. And of course, I will show you how to do this in a second. Just for now, just to see the difference. When I press start now, the result is not only absolutely correct, it's also extremely fast. So let's rewind that, and just to be sure I'm not cheating here, I reset the simulation. It's again, by the way, 14 copies, and I press start and I get constantly 20 frames per second. So more than double the speed, sometimes even more than that, depending on the case, while being much more accurate. So it's really worth it. That's what I want to show you with this. And especially when you have, much more complex scenes, it becomes more and more worth the effort. So how do we do this? Here you can see, first of all, we have an assemble. This is really just to create a name attribute. We will talk about this in the next video, but this here is interesting, the convex decomposition. And you might have noticed that the geometry actually looks different to what we used in this example here. And what this node is doing, like the name suggests, is it decomposes an object and makes it convex. So when we look at the simple bowl that we had in the beginning and we run this through a convex decomposition with the right settings, it's a bit hard to see, but what it actually does is it breaks it into smaller pieces. So we can actually show this here with the segment button, and you can see every color is now one object. And that's what the convex decomposition does. It turns one concave object into multiple convex objects, which is pretty clever. So the way you have to imagine this is, let's say this is our bowl. When you actually cut it in pieces, then you can actually cut it in a way that each piece is convex. And of course, if you do this multiple times, at some point you have the whole shape. So it's almost literally squaring a circle. That also means, of course, that the shape is not 100% accurate. But of course, the goal is to be only as accurate as necessary for the simulation to speed up as much as possible and find the sweet spot. And let me show you how to change this in the settings. Because when you have a bowl again and you drop a convex decomposition, by default, it actually doesn't do much other than turning this into a convex shape. And what's important here is the max concavity, and you have to dial this down. And this basically is the threshold of the concavity that it takes into account to decide when to cutting a piece into smaller pieces. So if I dial this down further and further, I get more and more pieces. That's all it means. So of course the problem is the more pieces you get, the more accurate the shape representation, but also the more time it needs to calculate this thing properly. So it's about, again, finding the balance, but this is what you really care about, the max concavity. This is what you have to dial down. And now we can see we have more pieces in a colorful way that we can use for the calculation. And of course, each piece here, very important, and we can show this maybe with an exploded view, is here you can see when you look closely, there is not a single concave object in here. There will always be convex, and that's the whole goal of the convex decomposition. So now that we know this, let's try this. We have now here our original balls. Here again, only 5 of them. And now we use a convex decomposition to fix that problem. So all we have to do is to lower the max concavity. In our case, we don't have to go too far. Maybe, yeah, something like this should be fine. And if we run this, everything should work out just fine, right? No, now they all break apart. Yes, of course, because now we have multiple objects. How to solve this problem, we will see in the next video. But for now, I hope it was helpful to understand the problem of convex and concave. Very important, we do use the convex decomposition, even though it doesn't seem to work. But in the next video, you will see what's missing. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.